there, and thank you for checking out this video. Today I'm making some fairly simple watercolour festive cards. So for the first one I'm using watercolour paint, watercolour paper, paintbrushes, plain cardstock, scissors and glue or tape. This one is going to be a snowy scene with some trees, and I'm using a watercolour postcard, but I want the scene to be a square, so I'm just marking up one side with some washi tape. I'm starting with the sky, and I'm mixing up some Payne's grey. This is quite a dark bluish grey, so it's good for night skies. I want the top to be a dark concentrated colour, so I'm taking the paint straight from the pan for the first few brush strokes, and then as I move down the page I'm adding some water to my brush to dilute the water. It doesn't have to be perfectly smooth, a few imperfections add some interesting texture. While that's drying, I'm mixing up some black with lots of water to make a transparent warmish grey colour. And once the background is completely dry, I'm adding trees to the bottom of the page. This first row of trees are supposed to be a little further in the distance, which is why I'm using the more transparent paint to start with. I'm creating these tree shapes very roughly. I'm starting with a straight line for the trunk, and then basically just blob my brush left to right from the trunk, creating uneven branches on both sides that are slightly angled downwards. There's no plan for where I'm putting the trees, I'm just randomly spacing them at different heights. After the background trees are dry, I'm using a much more concentrated black paint to create bigger trees in the foreground. I'm just using exactly the same technique, making sure that the trees are very narrow at the top and become much wider at the bottom. There's really no finesse with these trees, it's just blob the paint around and see what comes out. So to give the scene a bit more of a festive feel, I'm adding a star with some white paint. I find the white dries a bit transparent, so you may need to go over it a couple of times. Then I'm going to add some snow by doing small blobs of white paint with a fine brush. You can do the technique where you spray or tap a loaded paintbrush over the surface. This does give good effect, but it looks more like stars to me as it creates perfectly round dots. Snow is more uneven, so that's why I decided to go with blobs. I'm also adding a bit of snow to the top of the tree branches, just to add a little bit more depth. So when all that is perfectly dry, I'm peeling off the washi very carefully at an angle so as not to rip the surface of the paper, and then just trimming it down to size. And I'm not adding anything further to this, I'm just sticking my design onto some blank card, and there you have it. The next card is quite similar. I'm using black paper, blank cardstock, metallic watercolour paints, a thin paintbrush, a metallic gel pen and some tape. I've cut my paper to the size I want and I'm marking up a place for 4 trees and a message very lightly in pencil. I'm using the same technique to create 4 trees in different metallic shades. The paint needs to be quite thick to show up, but if you get it right, it looks really striking on this black paper. Here it is in real time again. Paint a straight trunk, then blob the paint unevenly from the top, moving down. Start at a point and get wider as you go down. Try to leave a gap between the blobby branches and angle them down slightly. It's better to try not to be too careful with your brush strokes. The more rough and suggestive, the better the outcome with this style. I used a copper gel pen to add the message and then I'm sticking it onto the card. This is a great design option if you want to make lots of cards. It's so quick to paint that it really only takes about 5 minutes for each one. This one's another super easy one. I'm using 300 GSM cold pressed watercolour paper, watercolour paints, brushes, blank card, salt, scissors, tape, a ruler, a pencil, and I'm also adding some star sequins. I'm starting out with a largish piece of watercolour paper and I'm mixing up 3 different shades of green. The greens in this set are quite bright, so I'm toning them down a bit by mixing in a little bit of blue and brown just to make them more natural looking. I'm going to use the wet on wet technique to cover this whole page with colour. So I have a large brush to cover the surface with plain water. Obviously you can just use a smaller brush, but it's a lot quicker if you have a big one. Once the whole page is wet, I'm just brushing the 3 different greens randomly over the surface. In some areas I'm just blobbing a little bit more paint to add variations in colour intensity. To create some more interesting patterns, I'm going to sprinkle some salt over the surface before it dries. Any type of salt will work, but I found that salt crystals give you more interesting shapes. Just sprinkle it around randomly. You can kind of see the liquid being drawn towards the salt, so don't go overboard with it or you'll lose the sort of blotchy effect that it gives. You can see the really interesting shapes created once it's dry. You can leave it to dry naturally, but if you're impatient like me, then you can use a heat tool to speed it up a bit. And then once it is completely dry, I'm just removing the salt by rubbing it off with my finger. So now I have this really interesting patterned paper, and I'm going to cut out some triangles to represent Christmas trees. I'm drawing a line each side of my colour block, then measuring 3 cm intervals along one edge. Then I'm doing the same on the other side, but I'm offsetting the intervals by 1.5 cm, so that I can create long, thin triangle shapes. It's quite hard to explain, but hopefully you can see what I'm doing. Once all the triangles are drawn, I'm cutting them out. These are quite modern or minimalistic shapes to represent Christmas trees. but you could cut out a more complex or a traditional shape as well. Now that I've chosen the ones that I want, I am sticking them down to a Kraft paper card. I think the green looks really great with the brown. And to finish off the trees, I'm adding a few stars to the top and then just some hand lettering to the bottom. And for my final design, I'm using watercolour paper again, watercolour paints, plain cardstock, paintbrush, and some tape. To start with, I'm lightly marking out my design in pencil. At the bottom, I'm doing some hand lettering, and my image is going to be a simple square gift box with a bow. I've already mixed my colours. I'm using 2 shades of red and 2 shades of green. The paintbrush I'm using is a size 2 pointed round brush, so it has a very fine tip which I need for this design. So I'm going to fill my shape with lots of tiny little symbols, keeping strictly within the pencil lines that I've drawn. I'm repeating the same shapes throughout. I've got 2 different leaves, a heart, a branch with some berries, some 4 and 5 petal flowers, and then just to fill in any gaps and really make the shape the exact size, I'm adding little stars and dots. Not gonna lie, this does take ages, but I think it's worth it. I do love the final outcome. So maybe it's better for close family and friends, or people who really will appreciate the effort that you've gone to. Alternatively, you could just scan your final piece and get them printed to send out to everyone, and then keep the original. When I've done all the areas I want to in red, I'm moving on to green to make the ribbon, and I'm just randomly switching between the 2 greens, although it doesn't really show the difference very well on the camera. So I'm just adding in my hand lettering at the bottom, and then I'm going to rub out all the pencil lines. Make sure everything is completely dry before you do that, because it would be a real bummer to smudge all the effort that you've just gone to. And then I'm sticking it onto my card, and there you have it. So there you have it, 4 different ideas for watercolour festive cards. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!